And for today, we have Kristi Perreault, who is a principal software engineer at Liberty Mutual Insurance. Kristi is going to share serverless journey.
Thank you so much, Alwina. I'm going to just share my screen real quick. Okay. All right, is everybody able to see my slides okay?
Looks great, Kristi.
Awesome. Oh, skipped right to the end there. Okay, so if this is your first time learning about or hearing about serverless, definitely don't worry about it. I'll go into a little bit more detail about what serverless is and what Serverless-First is as well. Since this is a smaller group, I'm definitely going to keep the chat up and the Q&A up. So if you have questions as I'm going through this, I'll try to keep my best to keep an eye on the chat and answer those as we go through. As Alwina mentioned, my name is Kristi Perreault. I'm a principal software engineer, and today we're going to talk a little bit about my journey and Liberty Mutual's journey through serverless and scaling a Serverless-First initiative. So just a quick kind of agenda for you. I'm going to give an introduction on myself and a little bit about Liberty Mutual and some of the great work and efforts we have going on with women in technology. We're going to define what serverless is what I mean when I say Serverless-First initiative, and talk a little bit about the current state of serverless at Liberty Mutual. I'm going to talk a little bit about what my team does in Serverless DevOps and some of the methodology that we follow. We'll talk about some of the areas that we're struggling with and looking to improve and some of our growth opportunities. And I'll talk a little bit about what's next for us. And I'll end with some Q&A. A little bit about Liberty Mutual Insurance, if you have not heard of us. So we exist to help people embrace today and confidently pursue tomorrow. And we do that by promising protection for the unexpected delivered with care. So some quick facts for you. We have about 45,000 employees globally, and roughly 5,000 of those folks are actually in our technology department. So we like to brand ourselves as a tech company first and an insurance company second. We're the 6th largest global property and casualty insurer, and we also rank on the Fortune 100 list. In 2021, we won a number of awards, one of them being one of the best 100 places to work in IT. And additionally, we have a pretty large focus on diversity and inclusion. We've received a perfect score of 100 the last 4 years in the Human Rights Campaign's Corporate Equality Index. Additionally, we've been voted as Forbes magazine's best employers for diversity, women, and new grads, as well as one of the best places to work for LGBTQ equality. If you want to know more information, want to see some of our open roles, feel free to check us out at lmi.co/tech, or definitely reach out to me after the presentation. I do a lot of work with recruiting and with women in tech at our organization. So a little bit about me. I am a principal software engineer at Liberty. I work on our Serverless DevOps and enablement team, where I really focus to help our 5,000 or so engineers move to the cloud as quickly and as efficiently and cost effectively as possible. I've been at the company for a little over 4 years full-time, plus a 1-year internship. I've done a number of things in that time. I've been focused in the serverless space for the last 2 or 3 years now. I was recently named an AWS Community Builder. I joined as part of this past March cohort in the serverless section. I recently wrapped up a master's degree in electrical and computer engineering from Boston University last January, which I did while working full-time. And I live out in Boulder, Colorado. So I hike, I ski, I mountain bike, I do everything and anything outside. And I'm also affiliated with the Women Who Code Denver Boulder group. So we do monthly tech meetups, and we welcome anybody outside of the region as well. So definitely feel free to check us out if you want to see more content like this. So I want to just start by defining a little bit of what serverless is. I know this is kind of a hybrid like cloud Python group, so not everybody may not be familiar, and sometimes it can be defined a little differently depending on where you're at. So the key things for us at Liberty Mutual to define serverless is it's an event-driven architecture, which means that you use events to trigger and communicate between your decoupled services. So it could be like a change in state or an update to things. And that's what drives your architecture and how you're building out your applications. Event-driven architecture makes it easy to provision services and resources. So you can spend a lot more time on your business functionality and your business code and less on your infrastructure code. You don't need to manage your servers. So this means like scaling up and down will happen automatically. You don't have like a big data center where you have to worry about all the physical hardware and everything. That's kind of handled for you through other vendors and providers. And probably really important for the businesses. And funny enough, if you heard our commercials, you only pay for what you need through serverless. So if you aren't utilizing resources or servers or anything, you don't need to pay for those things. It's just paying for what you use. So our current serverless state at Liberty Mutual, couple different things. So first of all, we're really embracing like a serverless-first initiative. And this means that you just try to approach your architecture as serverless right off the bat. And then you decide whether or not it's the best fit for you. So serverless fits most use cases, maybe not all of them. Some examples would be like if you're locked into using a certain tool or vendor, or if you have really long running data heavy intensive processes, serverless might not be the best fit. But for a lot of applications where you're using APIs and have a little bit of business logic or web development, serverless is a great option for that, which is the majority of our work at Liberty Mutual. So one of the things that we've developed is a kind of centralized pattern catalog, which I'll get into in a little bit more detail later on, where you can really get started with serverless development day one. So if you wanted to, we could have a brand new developer come in here, utilize one of our serverless starter patterns and be up and running in the cloud and deployed within an hour tops, which is really awesome. And this has led to some really rapid community adoption. So we've really lowered the barrier of entry. And it's been really helpful for folks to get started and up and running serverless in the cloud very quickly, very easily. So we've cultivated a serverless community pretty rapidly. This in turn has led to some external recognition. So actually last year in November of 2021, we were recognized on stage at the AWS reInvent conference with the CTO's keynote. So definitely doing some good things in this space. We're fairly mature as far as large companies go in serverless. So I want to talk a little bit about how we got to this point. So we have these awesome patterns. We have a great serverless community. We're being recognized externally, but what are kind of the steps that we have made or put in place to kind of get us to this point? So this is where my team comes into play. We call ourselves Serverless DevOps or the Serverless Enablement team. And I've kind of listed most of our responsibilities here. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them on this slide, but I will go into each of these points more in depth. So we do things like this pattern development. We are big on the support. We help with some security. Education's a big part of what we do, documentation. We collect a lot of metrics and data to help inform our decisions. And we're really just working towards this North Star of a strong serverless community. So the first thing I kind of want to talk about is our pattern development, because I've already mentioned it a couple times before. It's something that we've had a large focus on over the past couple of years. So this is really a community-driven effort. We want to defer to the community to be able to contribute these starter patterns. It's not completely just serverless either. This could be for other methods of working or tools or technologies. It's not just serverless, but we try to push our community to sort of drive this effort and to create their own patterns. What happens for us though is that we kind of want to still like kickstart and kind of offer these like bare bones out of the box projects to get you started with some of our most popular tools, which are, we work mostly with AWS. So it tends to be the CDK, which is the Cloud Development Kit, or AWS SAM, which is the Serverless Application Model. So we have developed some of our own patterns in Python and TypeScript that we surface to the users through a centrally maintained catalog of offerings that kind of everyone comes together and works to contribute to and to pull from and create offerings from. So we don't own the catalog, but we help to contribute to it and kind of kickstart this community-driven effort. Our goal is to really enable developers on day one with these patterns. So as I mentioned, anybody, even if it's your first day at the company, can come in and take one of these patterns and just immediately deploy it right out into the cloud and be serverless right away on day one, which is really cool. It's really lowered the barrier to entry and made it easily accessible to get started with serverless and to start understanding. Additionally, it's provided us on our team with a lot of metrics. So we can actually see how many people or how many projects have been generated using our patterns. Last I checked, I think our CDK Python one had been used about 1,200 times. So they're definitely very popular. They're definitely taking off. And it helps us to kind of prioritize where we need to be spending our time and to see what tools are the most valuable and being used the most throughout the company, so that we can pivot and build our backlog up to be something that's really valuable and useful for our tech community. So documentation, I know it's every developer's favorite topic. Nobody loves writing docs, but it's definitely the most helpful thing. And there's nothing more frustrating than going to use something and having really horrible documentation. So as a team, we really like to focus in this space as well. And I kind of broken this up into two pieces. So the what and the how. So some of the things that we like to document or to highlight for documentation would be how-to guides. So how to get started with things, how to utilize things like the CDK and SAM, how to start deploying to the cloud. Those sorts of guides are very important. We also have just generic, like kind of getting started guides that kind of go hand in hand with the how-to guides that we develop ourselves, we create, and we try to highlight and promote and share across the organization. Workshops is another big one. A lot of folks like to hands-on learn. So we'll do we've actually tailored the external CDK workshop to be an internal Liberty Mutual branded CDK workshop, which works out great because it integrates perfectly with our pipelines and our processes and tools here. Examples are huge. We like to point to different repositories. We actually maintain a couple different just project examples that I've actually been working on updating this week myself, both in Python and TypeScript. To point users to and say like, hey, here's a good example of getting started. Here's a good place to go. And this is even thoroughly documented with a lot of comments and README docs as well. And then as part of AWS, there is something called the well-architected framework. And that is one of our big goals this year, is to work on pushing the well-architected reviews. And these are just like a series of questions that you ask your development team and have them review through their applications to kind of match up to these pillars. So is this being optimized for cost? Is it performance efficient? And there's a whole series of questions and reviews to kind of go through to make sure you're being secure. And this is like a well-built kind of application. So this documentation is also huge and a great help and something good to point to. So these are all great. I want to kind of hit on how we're surfacing these to the user. So first is READMEs. I think I have linked out to every single one of these things in the majority of our READMEs, just to get the documentation as close to the code as possible. So if you're a developer, if you're in there, if you're working on it, you can find all of this documentation right there in front of you and you don't have to go digging for it. Repositories themselves are another huge thing just for documentation. Again, that goes really hand in hand with the examples piece here. We point to in our kind of offering in the catalog, we point to these different example repositories directly from that so that you can have your kind of out of the box solution and an idea of what you're going to get. Documentation hub. So we're pretty Atlassian suite heavy. So we have a lot of wiki docs. I have definitely used things like Gitbook before to just kind of encompass more things that maybe would be beyond just a README file or you need a lot more information for. Architecture diagrams are another big one. We've included some of these in our projects before too, and we try to document as much of our architecture as we can so that folks know exactly what resources they're getting out of the box. And finally, the patterns themselves are documented. So like I said, they'll link out to those READMEs, those examples, and we have like our own subset of documentation so that when you go into your offering, you know what you're going to get and you know what you can provision. So one of the next big things that we focus on is support. I'll highlight, we're not like on a support team or in like a support rotation or anything. However, as part of our jobs, we're trying to support the 5,000 other tech employees at our company. So we want to make sure, first of all, that we're readily available. We post our contact information on like all of these documentation sources so people know how to find us, how to reach us. We have a Slack tag so that folks can reach out to us if they need help with their patterns or with serverless development in general. We also like to answer questions. We have a pretty robust community in Slack and in Teams where folks will post questions constantly. So we try to be monitoring those and putting ourselves in there to answer questions. We also have like an internal Stack Overflow that we follow along with as well. And we have a service desk so people can reach out and submit tickets as they need help with things. But we have found that a lot of those places we don't get reached out to a ton because we've built up such a robust serverless community. So folks will post questions and it's kind of just community source where people will come in and answer questions or, hey, as kind of bleeds into the reuse a little bit. But folks will say like, hey, I have a question on this. I ran into this issue. Can somebody help me? And somebody will say, hey, like I ran into the same thing, a couple weeks ago. Like here's a link to my code repo. Check it out. Let me know what you think. Hopefully this solved your question. And then that's a resource for other people to go back and look at later. Feedback is another important piece. We really like to encourage like two-way open communication. So anytime we're working on something or we have a new product coming out, like we make sure that we get it in front of our serverless super users. We're sharing it out via blog posts and announcements and channels. So as much as like we want people to reach out to us, we're making sure that we're reaching out to them and we're staying in line with what the community is working on and what tools they like and that we're in line with what they need. Security is kind of another one. This enabling constraints area is kind of a fine line to walk. The issue here is that, we want to make sure that we're being secure and that we're building applications that are smart, but we also want to make sure we're not kind of putting up too many guardrails and making sure that we're still promoting collaboration and innovation and a lot of experimentation. So this one's kind of a line that we have to balance a little bit. The first way we do this is through a series of security checks or rules. So we actually have an application that's really integrated into our pipelines that will sort of flag or delete your resources if you try to deploy something that's not within our guidelines. So usually this means maybe if you over provision something, if you're using a resource that we're not approving or hasn't gone through a security review yet, like it'll kind of block you from deploying these things, which helps us kind of understand where the need is. It can get a little frustrating for folks sometimes, but we try to make sure that these are really well documented and they're pretty, spread through the community. As I mentioned, if somebody runs into something, they'll post it in Slack or Teams, and usually it's just a quick share to say like, hey, this is a rule, we have to follow this kind of thing, and here's how to fix it, or kind of get around it. Like I said, this integrates perfectly with our build and deploy pipelines, so there isn't too many surprises. It's not like you kind of get something out there and running for a while and then you realize there's a big security issue. This is like a great way for us to monitor what's going on. And it also helps us with resource tagging. So this is one of the biggest things we enforce with these security checks. The resource tagging helps us kind of track some cost data and some ownership things so that we know as things come up or are out of date. One of the more popular ones that we try to monitor are like the versions that our Lambda functions are running on. So if you still have a Lambda function that's using Python 2.7, if your resources are tagged appropriately, we can see who owns that and kind of reach out to them and make sure it's being cleaned up or updated, since there's been a lot of security patching and things that come out before that, after that. So the resource tagging helps us keep track of who's using what, who's deploying what, and then how much you're costing, and if there's any tech debt out there that you may need to address. Education is another piece of what we're following and doing and kind of trying to promote. So the probably most obvious thing is with trainings and workshops. We really want to make sure that we're getting out to in front of our tech leads specifically, because those are the folks that are going to kind of push it outwards through the organization and kind of filter down through the rest of our developers. So this could be tech team leads, these could be architects. In some cases, they might even be like directors and things. But just making sure that they're educating themselves on what serverless is, how to embrace the Serverless-First initiative, and then the different services and resources and tools and all of those things that are available to them. So going through trainings and workshops is one way that we do this. Sometimes they're day or 2 day long workshops. Sometimes they're just things you look into on your own. There's a ton of great video resources out there and blog posts and just an overwhelming amount of content for serverless. So you can definitely just even do a quick Google search and find a dozen different courses to go through and videos and trainings. So that's definitely really supported. We have a lot of licenses for certain platforms and things, so we can get this training that we need. Experimentation, we really love promoting this. There's nothing better than getting hands-on experience with something and working through a problem as a team or on your own to kind of play with new resources and tools. We have kind of an open AWS account or sandbox account where you can go in, and it doesn't have those security checks and restrictions on them. It's a very low level environment below your like develop and non-prod environments where you can test things out, try different things, see what works, play with some stuff, and just lead to some innovation and possibly bringing in new services and learning how to do cool stuff on your team. We want to build our tech leads up to be examples to model. So we want them to be the ones that are kind of like, hey, we're really on board with this serverless thing. We want our teams to use it. We're trained, we know what we're doing, we played around with it. Like, hey, we're going to be the examples or the figureheads of these departments and these groups. We're only a team of now 4 people. So to manage 5,000 folks, it's really difficult. So we would want to lean on our educated tech leads to kind of spread these best practices and these missions of things. And finally, I did mention earlier in the documentation section a little bit about well-architected. We are pushing for well-architected reviews a lot more this year. We really want to review I think there's 6 pillars now for well-architected. So we want to go through and make sure that we're hitting those things with cost, with performance. Sustainability is the new one for this year as well. So we want to make sure that our tech leads are educated on what they need to look for these well-architected reviews, how to ask these questions, where to find this configuration data, and how to really promote like a well-architected application. So I just noticed one of the questions in the chat that you mentioned that serverless applies to most use cases other than some. Can you give some examples? Sure. So I would say I kind of talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but usually when you don't want to use serverless is like when you have really long running, very data heavy, intensive processes. So this might be if you're at a company that's, doing a lot with data and like huge data lakes and data sets. The most that we're seeing these use cases for is, we have a lot of applications or services that are user facing. So, we're an insurance company, so people are using their mobile apps or websites and things to submit and process claims and file stuff. And So we have like a lot of kind of full stack applications where there's like a front end and you need storage and compute and some of those things. So those are like helpful tools. Those are helpful like applications that we would use a lot of this in. So basically anything that has that structure of like compute storage, you can break things down into microservices and have smaller pieces of like functionality is like great for a serverless use case. Oh, you used to work at Liberty too. Yeah, one thing we faced really difficult was moving legacy code to serverless. Yeah, that's definitely a tough one. I think I'll talk about that a little bit later in kind of like our what's next and one of the things we're struggling with. But that's something that we really do want to focus on because for those that don't know, we're a 100-year-old company, 100-plus-year-old company, and we have definitely taken on a lot of legacy code over time. And there's definitely teams that are working on really keeping the lights on. So yeah, migrating to serverless is definitely a huge issue. That's something that we're working on, but I'll speak to in a little bit too. And examples of serverless patterns we've come up with. So we try to do just like a very basic bare bones like application that just gets you started with the project structure, and maybe like, you know, the most popular AWS serverless service is a Lambda function, and it's just like a small unit of business functionality code. So we basically just give everybody that out of the box and then just give them a ton of documentation and resources to point them where they need to go. Because solutions are going to be different for everybody and we don't want to be too opinionated. So S3 buckets, Dynamo tables, Aurora databases. There's like a dozen different examples of storage solutions, of API solutions that we don't want to assume that folks are using. And there's nothing worse than getting a starter pattern and then having to go through and delete all the stuff you don't need. So we try to keep it pretty basic, and then we let the community drive patterns that they are seeing really frequently. So like for a private API gateway with like a Lambda function or with a database, that's a common pattern. So you'll see some more that'll come out of that. But again, with 5,000 people there, we're definitely doing different things across the organization. So in some cases, certain departments will reuse a pattern a lot that doesn't apply to another department. So we kind of let them field those things, and then we just give very basic, try to push for best practices and out of the box examples. Okay, I think that's all the questions for now. I'll keep an eye on the chat. Thank you guys. Awesome. So one of the main applications that my team does own is a metrics collection application. And this helps us make really informed data-driven decisions. So the three big things that we get out of this are tech debt, security, and cost metrics. So right now we have a process that goes out into hundreds of different AWS accounts and all our different environments that we have set up out there. And it pulls this data for two of, I would say, our most popular serverless resources at Liberty, which are Lambda functions and API gateways. The last I checked was about a week or two ago, and we have almost 70,000 Lambda functions and about 6,000 API gateways running out in our accounts. So that is a lot of data. That is a lot of resources out there to manage. But by doing those things like appropriately tagging our resources, we can see like which departments these roll up to, which folks are owning these things, how frequently they're being updated. So we can pull some of these numbers. So, you know, if we see something out there that hasn't been deployed for 2 years, probably reasonable to assume it's tech debt and it's something that we want to clean up. Flip side, I mentioned earlier, you know, like there's issues with if you're still on Python 2 or Python 3.6 or, you know, Node 10, I think was our most recent one too. We can see all of that running in the Lambda functions, and, you know, we'll flag those as things that are not very secure and we want to make sure we're up to date on. So we can see some of those security constraints, and we can also see some of those security checks and what people are running into and having issues with. And then cost is super important here too. We work a lot with our FinOps team as well, who really tracks this data, but this insight really helps us to show, okay, how much are we spending in the serverless space or in the Lambda space? And do these things really need to be running 24/7? You know, if it's something that's just deployed out to our sandbox account, maybe somebody just forgot to go back and clean it up. It's leading to cost, it's leading to tech debt, and then it's getting out of compliance. So these are really the three big areas that we're using for these data-driven decisions, and it helps us drive our product backlog and figure out where we need to focus our time and effort and potentially where there might be some education gaps as well. So all of these things kind of culminate into our serverless community at Liberty Mutual. And I think the important thing that our team tries to say all the time is that we don't want to be the community. We don't want to be the ones driving all these changes. We don't want to be the ones that are pushing for certain tools or technologies. We just want to be part of the community and stewards of the community. So in an ideal world, we're going to let our developers be empowered and decide what tools they like and what tools that they want to use through innovation and through experimentation. And then in turn, work with them to make sure that we're providing them with the best, things and tools that they want to use. So a great example of that is, CDK has really bubbled up as a very most frequently used tool across the community. And as soon as CDK v2 was announced at reInvent last year, it was, when is this being enabled at Liberty? This is what we really want. And that's ended up being what we focused on for this first quarter, is rebootstrapping our accounts for V2 because we saw the drive from the community. So we're stewards of the community. We want to kind of put up some guidelines, but we want to promote this innovation, this experimentation, and let them guide us to what they need and what we should be supporting and enabling. So we are pretty mature in serverless. Lambda's been around for about 7 years now. Like I said, we have hundreds of AWS accounts, and I mentioned all the resources we have out on the cloud. So especially for an older company and a large corporation, we're doing pretty well in the serverless space. But as I alluded to, there are definitely places that we are struggling and things that we have opportunities for growth with. The first of these is a day 2 development. So I mentioned how we have these great patterns and it's lowered the bar for day 1 development. So you can have somebody brand new come into the organization, take a starter application and be out and running in the cloud and be serverless within a day. So that's awesome. You have a great deployable project. We're all excited. We're up in the cloud. But then they start looking at this and saying, okay, this is awesome. Like, I have my Lambda function, but I need a database, or I need to store these files somewhere, or I need to hit an API. Like, what do I do with this now? I have this great example, but I need all these other resources and I don't know how to get them or what to do with them. And then that kind of leads to just a deeper understanding of how these things work, how resources get provisioned, what you need, what's kind of go forward, how are we handling security, how are we doing these things within our company, because sometimes the examples and stuff externally don't always match up with some of our processes or security internally. So this is definitely a gap and something that we're focused on looking at this year. How do we get folks from just deploying a project to actually being really empowered and understanding what they need to do? And some of that is going to be through education. It's going to be through this transparency, these documentation, and this is something that we're focusing on. The second is scaling this education. So I mentioned that, and one of the things that we are doing pretty well with is educating our tech leads. But with 5,000 developers and only 4 of us, we can only reach out to as many people as we can. So it becomes this question of, how do we help everyone? There's different departments and different groups and different organizations all across the company that are focused on very different things. So there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all answer for things, which is also why a lot of our patterns are very bare bones and very starter and out of the box, because we need to make sure that it's available for everyone doing kind of everything. You're going to have more data in some teams, you're going to have more logic on other teams. Some are owning really old patterns and things that need to be, or applications that need to be updated. Other people are building out brand new applications and they're really mature in serverless. So it's really hard to kind of cover that gap and scale this education kind of across the board. And along with that, like, centralizing tools and practices are really difficult too, because not everybody is going to the same thing day to day to do their development. This catalog is a really great start with that. I think a lot of folks have access to that and jump in there, especially from what we're seeing with our metrics traction, with about like 1,200 or so people or projects being created with our starter pattern. But it's difficult to reach out to all groups and make sure everybody's on the same page, and that we are trying to lead people to using best practices. And also protecting our teams. One of the biggest complaints we get is, and alluding to the question earlier about, it's really difficult moving legacy code to serverless. Teams need that time to learn about serverless and to go back and address that tech debt. Sometimes you turn into a bit of a feature factory where it's not always clear to the business like why you need to do these things and migrate applications and spend time doing that when you need to build out these 10 other features and services. But we're trying to argue that taking the time up front to do this is going to save you a lot of time, money, and issues in the future. And it's ultimately going to make your applications and things more secure, more cost effective, and really more well architected. So having those conversations across the board with everyone and making sure that serverless is the right fit for your team, because as I mentioned, we want to embrace serverless first, but that doesn't mean serverless everything. So those are some conversations that we're trying to have, and we're trying to build up kind of a super serverless users group that is representative everywhere in the company. This goes into a lot of this idea of consistency and reuse at scale. So this is kind of a term that I've coined over the last year or two from working in the serverless spaces. We see a lot of silos of serverless pop up. So I actually think just the other day, someone asked me about which CDK library was go forward, and they sent me 5 of them, and I had only heard of 2. So it's really difficult to keep a pulse on all of the serverless development happening all across the company, because we can't physically reach out to every single team. So, we see these silos pop up where we find libraries or tools that other teams or departments or groups have created, and haven't maybe shared that broadly out. So that hits on the knowledge sharing piece a little bit too. We want to promote knowledge sharing, share things in the Slack channels and the Teams channels. We're trying to make our presence known as a team so that we can kind of connect all of these silos and make sure that folks are working towards the same goals and have the best practices, because we've seen differences of that across different organizations depending on what people are doing. All at the same time, we want to avoid being too rigid in what we're kind of preaching out to folks as well, because we don't want to scare people away from that experimentation and that innovation. Serverless is still relatively new. Lambda's been around for 7 years, which, depending on how long you've been in tech, that could seem like a long time, but it's actually a very short amount of time in the grand scheme of things, especially in a 100-year-old company. So we want to make sure that we're not kind of scaring people away from this concept of serverless because we're making it too difficult to get started with, or there's too many things to follow, guidelines to follow, and rules that they're running into. So again, tough problems to solve, and things we're hoping to work on this year. So we want to make sure we're promoting this experimentation. Again, this comes with some downsides though. When we first started out with AWS, we had like 3 main accounts that everybody used. And we very quickly hit account limits, and they got very bloated, difficult to find and search for resources in here. So we have since learned, and we're trying to push for team level accounts. Now we have hundreds of AWS accounts, which is great, but we still have these centralized, pretty bloated accounts, one of which being that sandbox account that we promote for experimentation quite a bit. Folks will build something and goes into cloud tech debt a little bit here. They build something, check it out, pretty cool, and then they forget to go back and clean it up, or they don't know how to clean it up, or they think they're going to use it and they don't. And then we have a ton of resources sitting out there that we're tracking in our data and saying like, hey, we have 70,000 Lambda functions, but there's probably 1,000 of those that aren't really in use, or are really out of date, or need to be cleaned up or deleted. So it's leading to these bloated accounts, a lot of tech debt in these accounts. We need to find the time to do cloud experimentation. Some teams and areas are better at this than others. Some are very busy with support requests and service, and they're building out new features and applications very quickly. And it's really hard to find the time to experiment with things, to innovate with things. So as an organization, I think we're doing better at providing our developers with time to innovate and to experiment, but we definitely could still be doing better in this area. And finally, reporting out. sometimes folks go in and they create these really cool things and then they don't really share it back with their team, or they realize it's a dead end really quickly, and then they abandon it, and maybe it warrants a conversation with their 4 or 5 developers, but it's not shared wider at Liberty or shared wider across the organizations. So then you have people kind of duplicating work and spending time looking into things that we might not support, or there might be a lot of security issues with. So being better at reporting out and really sharing your experiences when doing this experimentation is another place that we could improve. And finally is kind of this buy-in from tech leadership. So I'll say that we're definitely very on board as a company with serverless, and with getting to that point. Our leadership team really loves this idea of, we're only paying for what we need. Things are managed for us. It's relatively cheap in comparison of keeping data centers afloat. But there's some discrepancies a little bit still. Like I said, this definition of serverless and what serverless-first means is conversations we're still having. It's really become synonymous with Lambda, and we have to work pretty hard to say, like, no, this isn't just slap a Lambda function in your project and you're suddenly a serverless team and you're doing things serverless. It's more than that. It's a complete mind shift change, and a switch to like event-driven architecture. Understanding serverless as a product is another one too. Like I said, it's not building out a feature that our customers will see kind of instantaneously. It's something that kind of needs to happen in the background a little bit, but will provide a lot of value in the long run because our services are going to be faster, they're going to be more cost effective, and they're going to be easier to use and provision and maintain and understand. So kind of getting that concept across is difficult. And then again, just prioritizing the time to have this education and to work through these upgrades, and work through, this learning curve that we need to have. So where are we headed? I'll jump into this. I see another question come through about what has Liberty Mutual done to start the cleanup of bloated accounts and tech debt? Maybe at the start of development, letting folks know when to clean up their tech debt or delete accounts that are no longer needed. Yeah, definitely. That's something that we're starting to do. And that metrics collection process has been huge with this. It's difficult because you don't want to send another 1,000 emails to people like, hey, clean this up. We're trying to kind of tap folks on the shoulder a little bit. We're getting better with this. But yeah, we have a whole separate team that actually manages like the account governance. Like our AWS team kind of deals with provisioning roles and accounts and those kind of things. So I know that they're trying to keep a pulse on what accounts are more in use than others, or where some of the cleanup needs to happen. But we're trying to do that as much as we can. And some of those security rules help with that. So for instance, if you have like a Python 2 Lambda function out there, if you try to run that or deploy to that again, our process is going to fail you to do that. And it's going to force you to update those things or to delete them if they're no longer in use. So we're trying to do some stuff right now, but the resource tagging definitely helps us huge so that we know who to go to, because we didn't start that right at the beginning. And it made it difficult to decide, who owns that. And with big companies, we go through reorgs every couple of years. So things get shuffled around and lost a little bit. But at least now we have some account owners and people that we can reach out to. So starting that process is difficult. I think as of a couple months ago, it's like in place now. So you really can't put anything up there unless it's tagged appropriately. It's more of retroactively going back and making sure that things are cleaned up and we reach out to the right folks. We're trying to automate some of this as well. Okay, so this is the last little bit that I have for you guys here. I know it's been a lot. Great questions, by the way. Thank you for the chat. So this is kind of our future state. I'm really excited about this year because we have some really cool things that I think are going to address a lot of these pieces. First, we want to be collecting more data. Like I said, we're really big on Lambda and API Gateway, but we haven't touched on our storage resources yet. There's a lot of permission things. There's a lot of information out there that we can continue to collect and to act on. We want to continue standardizing some processes and pushing those best practices, and also educating people. and just expanding to each and every corner of the company. So like I said, we have a lot of folks that are really mature in serverless and just want the newest thing that gets announced at reInvent every year to already be out there and running. And then we have folks that are still like not even sure about the cloud or what's in it. So kind of reaching every area of the organization would be huge. And we have some really cool ideas this year for building out a sort of process for helping with those well-architected reviews, which I think in turn is going to hit on each and every one of these pieces. So we want these things to come together so that we can really create a community of empowered developers. So like I said, that kind of North Star is having our developers come to us with what they want, what they're seeing. You know, they play with things and they experiment with stuff, and they think it'll really help their use cases. So we want to build developers up so that they have those opinions and the time to experiment with things, and then we can just help them enable what they need. So this is a little bit of our hope for the future. And, you know, a lot of those areas where I said we're struggling are areas that we're looking to address this year. And we're pretty mature in serverless, but we still have some ways to go. And I'm excited to continue bringing it through and continue to mature in the serverless space. So that is all I have for you today. I know it was kind of a lot, especially if you've never heard of serverless before. So hopefully it was valuable, it was useful. My Twitter handle is here. I'm pretty active on that. I do a lot of speaking, like at webinars like this. I will also be at the AWS San Francisco Summit, DevOps Days Denver, and the Serverless in the Park conferences across the next 3 weeks in person. So if you're going to be at any of those or want to check those out, definitely reach out to me. I will also say that we have the CDK conference coming up. It is virtual and completely free. It's unfortunately on the same day as the Connect conference, but because it's virtual and free, you could sign up for both and kind of just flip-flop between the two of them and watch the recordings for both. Alternatively, if you're interested in speaking at it, our CFPs are open until April 20th. Would love to see some more ladies applying for that. So reach out to me if you want to get one in before the deadline. I'd love to work with you on that. And feel free to add me, reach out to me. If you have any questions, we got like 5 minutes left, but you can definitely reach out to me afterwards if you think of something later too. And I do see one about conducting well-architected reviews at scale, and does your team review every project? That is a great question, and that is exactly what I'm excited about this year. So right now we do have some like serverless and well-architected subject matter experts kind of spread out throughout the company that are working with teams kind of one-on-one right now to conduct those well-architected reviews. There's 6 pillars. There's one on sustainability, there's a cost optimization, there's performance, there's a security one. So there's a whole bunch of different pillars, but in our experience with working through, I have sat in on a couple of these, working with one team on one app, it takes anywhere between 3 and 6 hours to review a pillar, which you wouldn't think with the well-architected, it's, you know, maybe 20 questions per pillar. So you wouldn't think it takes that long, but it sparks a lot of discussions and conversations and back and forth. And some of that is just because they don't have the right data or the right metrics in front of them. So that's something that we're working on trying to be more transparent with, and not necessarily automating well-architected reviews, because those discussions and those processes and walking through applications are still really important. We want to make sure that there's still some manual aspect to that and teams are having that discussion. But we're looking to try and get more individualized data in front of our teams so that they're going into these reviews much more well-informed and have a good idea of the questions and things. And then hopefully, you know, after going through one team, one application, the rest of their applications become a little easier, a little faster to do. So we're definitely pushing for that at scale this year. So I'm hoping that some of that will work out great, and we're really involved in that process. Have I met the email? I have not. I have met Doug though. I have met Doug.
Thank you so much, Kristi. Do we have any more questions for Kristi? I think at this point, if you don't want to write it in chat, you could come off mute and share your question with Kristi. We do have about 2 minutes left. Oh, well, Stephanie has shared. Please share any questions in the chat so that way we can read it out.
Thank you for the questions throughout. Those were awesome. Glad it was helpful.
Okay, if there are no more questions, we are going to close out.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for the great questions today. I really appreciate it. And if you think of anything, feel free to reach out. I'm definitely available on LinkedIn and Twitter. Happy to answer any questions.
And thank you again, Kristi, for joining us today from Liberty Mutual Insurance. Thank you to everyone who attended our event today. And Stephanie has shared quite a few resources and links to Women Who Code Cloud, links for upcoming events, Connect, Recharge, and pretty much everything you need in regards to Women Who Code Cloud. Thank you again, Kristi, for sharing serverless journey. And thank you to all our participants.
Thank you.